A reading from Daniel chapter 5, verses 17 through 28. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let the gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not hear or see or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: many, many, tekel and parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This is the word of the Lord.
Hi, my name is Bob. I'm the lead pastor here at the meeting place. My friends, we are in a study of the book of Daniel. And I want to invite you into the journey of what it looks like to actually take a look and study and to discover some things. And so I want to share with you right up front, as we're talking through Daniel chapter 5 and 6 today, that when we look at Scripture, when we spend time in the Word, that there are a number of things that might be helpful to us to discover some of the significance of the text. And here are the 4 things. For those of you that are journaling, you can write these down. So we're looking for parallels, we're looking for problems, we're looking for pointers, and we are looking for, there's a 4th P, it just escapes me now for just a moment, parallels, problems, pointers, and patterns. Patterns is the 4th thing. And as we look at a text, we can sometimes make discoveries. So I want to dive right into chapter 5. And so here is the story that we're looking at today. It says this: King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the thousands. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And this is a party. He's throwing a party, and what he's done is he's decided in the middle of the revelry of this party, it's an adult party. There are things that are going on that are not pleasing to God, but he's decided that as part of this party, he's going to take the vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and he's going to bring these vessels into the party. These are things that were consecrated to God. And so it says this. It says that Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So understand that they're praising these gods that are not the true God with vessels that were dedicated to the true God. And this is what's happening here. And if you look at the book of Ezra in chapter 1, you actually discover that there were lots of vessels. So in other words, it's not just a few people who are using these, but rather the entire gathering seems to have access to these vessels and they're drinking. And so then it makes you wonder, well, what is this going to do? Like, what's going to happen in the story? What's going to unfold? And this is the thing that actually happens. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. And then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So imagine the writing on the wall. Imagine there's a plaster wall, and suddenly a human hand appears, and it writes these words. And King Belshazzar looks over and sees this happening, and his color changes, is what he's saying. This is a little line that's going to repeat, which is the thing that we should pay attention to, this notion that his color changed. His body is in alarm mode. He is responding to this thing with great fear. His blood is rushing from his body to essentially look after the health of his internal organs because he's in such a state of distress because of what he's seeing on this wall. And all of the stuff, you imagine the noise, and suddenly with his hand appearing, these words being written on the wall, the entire thing just kills the party and everything becomes very quiet. He was purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed and his color changed. There's a repeat of that. And his lords were perplexed. Notice here that he makes a great promise, that the person that can actually read the words that are on this wall, which is an interesting thing, that he is so terrified of these words to begin with, but he doesn't even understand them yet. Now he's trying to figure out, like, what are these words? What is the meaning of these? And so he's turning to the wise men that he knows and says, can you please help? And as a promise for their success, he makes a great promise. A purple robe, a gold chain, and third in line to lead this kingdom. Why is that? Well, it's interesting. If you do a little research, you discover that Belshazzar is actually the son of the actual king, who's off-site doing something, probably conquering other territories. So he's not even first in line. But in this case, what he can promise is the third spot, because of course the first two are taken. Nabonidus, they were perplexed. So the story continues. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. She's also picking up on the panic that's true in Belshazzar. This is awful. Like, he probably had to go do laundry, quite frankly, because he's so alarmed because of this. And the repeat of that just tells you how distressed he actually was, right? And in this moment, you notice this is not Belshazzar's wives, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Very interesting invitation. She remembers that during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, there was this person who was able to interpret dreams and all kinds of things. This is the person that should be called. Now, I just want to point out, there's lots of references in here that Nebuchadnezzar, who was this great Babylonian king, this well-respected, well-regarded authority, is the father to Belshazzar. That's not entirely true. There are some other kings between, but great king who came before you, the one in some ways in whose succession you continue to reign, is a person who, when he found that he needed help, turned to this person. And so she's trying to persuade Belshazzar to invite Daniel. This is how the story continues. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the Spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Isn't this an amazing testimony, an amazing resume of Daniel's? that he's respected and regarded this way, that this is how he served the kingdom in the past. And now it's like this queen is saying, like, I think you should turn to him. And Belshazzar then flatters Daniel in some ways to say, like, hey, I hear that this is the person who you are. This is your reputation. Notice Daniel's response. No, sorry, the king continues. Yeah, next slide, please. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give me interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And now we get to Daniel's response. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. These with great capacity, continue to be in some ways reduced, and they are continually put into their place. And so this instance, Daniel's not impressed. The purple robe and the gold chain and the third place in line, like none of those things matter to him. In some ways, he's sort of saying to the king, you're trying to offer me all these grand things. I'm not that impressed. And so this is his response. And then Rhonda read for us Daniel's response to Belshazzar. And I just want to wrap it up by saying this is basically the premise of Daniel's response. To say to the king, listen, Nebuchadnezzar is this great king of like an ancestor of yours, this great king. And he, during his lifetime, also really thought very highly of himself. But then there came a moment where God humbled him. And Nebuchadnezzar, and you can read this in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar was reduced basically to living like an animal. And it was only after he was humbled to that degree that he finally turned around and did in fact acknowledge that the God that Daniel believed in was the true God, was the living God, was in fact the Almighty One. Nebuchadnezzar recognized that. And this is what Daniel says in response to Belshazzar, and then continues to include these words. Then from his presence, so this is now going to the actual writing on the wall that appeared that shut this party down. Daniel says, then from his presence, this is God, the hand was sent and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. He finally gets to the interpretation to help the king understand this. Now, is this good news for the king? Does this sound like an encouraging message? No, I think this confirms that the writing on the wall that scared him so much was, in fact, a message that should be feared. And so he does recognize that there was something that triggered that in him, and Daniel says, this is the news. This is not good news for Belshazzar, and so this is actually how this unfolds. The story continues. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck. I guess in the end, the king insisted, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That's the outcome. That's how this ends. So that's chapter 5 for us. What else did we notice in terms of the references or some things that might be sort of triggers for us? And here's the one that triggers this thing for me. This is the thing that I explored a little bit further. There was a curiosity for me. When the writing appeared, and it says it was written on plaster, there seems to be a theme of stone, of plaster. We're going to explore that a little bit further. There's something about that made me sort of just be curious. But then what I'm also curious about is why, when the words appeared and were scribed into the plaster, and they were carved into there, so in other words, they remained in place. It's not like they appeared and then they disappeared. So they were now permanently etched into the plaster of this room. Why was there need for a human hand to appear? And it made me curious, and so I went back and looked at the text again and said, well, what does it say about the hand? And these are the hand references in this chapter 5 in Daniel as we're looking at it. Here's the first one. Immediately the fingers of a human hand, so at first it looks like just fingers, appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Okay, so there's this reference to a hand. So it makes me curious, and here I just want to invite you into the bigger picture. We understand that in the Old Testament there are declarations that say that God has never been seen by a human, that he's invisible. And yet we read in the Old Testament there are references specifically in relation with very specific people, like Moses, for example, where it says at some point that he met in a tent called the Tent of Meeting, and he sat with God as a friend. We recognize that even though the Old Testament says that God is an invisible God, that he does appear sometimes, and when we look at the Old Testament references, it is appropriate for us to consider that any time that God makes an appearance in the Old Testament, that it's in the form of Jesus. They didn't know Jesus. He hadn't yet been introduced to the world, if you want, but there's this reference to Jesus. The interesting thing is that in the New Testament, this is confirmed because Jesus often turns to the scribes of the day and says to them, "Didn't you read your scriptures? Like, you should already be familiar with me. I shouldn't be such a stranger to you. You should have already known about me." And so you wonder, well, where are all these Old Testament references that speak to Jesus? And so his response, even to the scribes of his day, he says to them, if you want to see the Father, just look at me. And then you see who he is, because I am just a different voice of the Father, but I represent him, and so then he can be known. And so it made me wonder, and this is what I want to propose to you, is that the hand that appears, that's writing this etching into the plaster, is the hand of Jesus. When this plan was discussed in heaven, Jesus raised his hand and said, "I'll lend a hand to that adventure." And so his hand appears. Let's explore this a little bit further. There's other hand references in chapter 5. Let's look at those. So here's another one in verse 23 of this chapter. "And you've praised the gods of silver and gold," this is Daniel speaking to Belshazzar, "of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know." So he's essentially saying the whole Babylonian Empire is based on serving gods that are made of these material things. They don't see, they don't hear, they have no way of engaging. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. This is essentially holding Belshazzar responsible that he didn't recognize that his authority, the place that he played in the Babylonian Empire, was given to him by God. This was by his hand. Here's another reference to hand in verse 24. "Then from his presence the hand was sent." This is from the presence of God, and this writing was inscribed. So that's the reference to where I'm suggesting to you that this is the hand of Jesus. And then we carry on, because it does remind us that there's other places where there's evidence of God's hand appearing, or certainly where he's writing. And one of the classic occasions of this is Exodus chapter 32, where Moses is on Mount Sinai. He's receiving the 10 Commandments. And then, of course, he brings them to the base of the mountain. It's another story worth exploring, but just want to illustrate what it says about these tablets. Again, notice there's a stone reference. There's the stone, clay, plaster. There's a theme there. "Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back. They were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets." Further evidence of a moment where God writes, where he's the author of words that appear, and it appears that his hand is at work. These are not things where Moses had to bring his little chisel and hammer kit and try to keep up as Jesus or as God is like reciting the 10 Commandments. He's trying to carve us into stone. No, these things were created by God. And then, of course, made me wonder, like, where are other references of the written word written by God's hand? And it takes us to an interesting text in the Gospel of John. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. Do you realize that this is the only reference to Jesus having the skill to write? We have no written gospel of Jesus. But this is a moment where Jesus is writing on the ground, in the dirt. The story continues. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with a woman standing before him. This makes me so curious. I realize that the text in John does not tell us what Jesus wrote on the ground. There's been curiosity, all kinds of conjecture about what it is that he possibly might have been able to write there. Something that, of course, was powerful enough that it undid the urgency, the pressure of the moment. That the leaders, these people who had gathered to do the thing that they thought was the just and right thing to do to this adulterous woman, that they should walk away. And it gave an opportunity for Jesus to speak with this woman and have his own conversation with her to help her for the future. But here's the curious thing. And so I'm making the connection because I was drawn into the text and looking at these written words of God by his own hand. In this case, it's Jesus writing. If you've seen Mel Gibson's movie on the Passion of the Christ, there's a moment where, and in his film, there's a representation of this, and it's just a lion in the sand, but it's very, very powerful. It has like very, very powerful images. And so for just a moment, I thought, is it possible? Because, of course, the people that were gathered would know the Old Testament text. Is it possible that Jesus wrote, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin? Because here's the thing. What it communicated to Belshazzar in the moment when it appeared on the wall was basically, I've been observing you. I've been measuring you. I've been testing you. And you have fallen short. And as a result of that, there's going to be some consequences. Is it possible that the same message was delivered by Jesus to those men that were gathered, that were going to stone this woman, to say, you've been observed? And when he says to them, for those of you without sin, throw the first stone, was this his way of saying, you've been measured and you've been found wanting? There's going to be consequences. The truth of the matter is, when God decides to interrupt life with written words, we see powerful, powerful things happen. And then there's yet one more reference, which I just so love, and I want to get there very quickly. You yourselves, this is in 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing this to the Corinthians. You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all, and you should show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Essentially, the writing of God extends beyond. I mean, the fact that he's writing onto walls, onto the ground, onto stone tablets is like his way of saying, my voice will intersect with the real things of your life. But in this instance, it's like there's a further writing project that I'm about. I want to write on your hearts. I want you to be confirmed that you, in fact, are my image bearers. Right? Because when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, they burst into the temple. What they found were dishes. They didn't find statues to God because, of course, he had decided a long time ago that there would never be such a thing, but rather that we would be his image bearers. I love this. This is the kind of thing that I think is available to us when we look at Scripture to pursue these things. I noticed this hand that appeared, and it caused me to go down all of this way just to understand more of the character, the nature of God. I just want to ask you this morning, before we very quickly get to chapter 6, I want to ask you this question. These questions. As you reflect on this, as you think about Belshazzar's experience, as you think about those men who were about to stone that adulterous woman, are there words that you think he might want to have appear on one of the walls of your life to stop the way things are, to interrupt and invite you into something new? Are there words that he has written on your heart that you need to pay attention to again to remind us? As we had a baptism, this young woman is going to be a messenger of Jesus because of what's written on her heart. Chapter 6. You understand, we don't have time to go through chapter 6. There's just not enough time. But here, this is what I want to do. I said to you, the 4 Ps. I'm going to try to remember them: pattern, problem, pointers, and parallels. Got them. Here's the thing in chapter 6. I read chapter 6, and I noticed something very curious. If you want bookends, here's the beginning of chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. to whom these satraps should give accounts that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Notice that Daniel is elevated. His position, he's clearly a person who has been infused by the Spirit of God to do some remarkable things, and Darius the king recognizes this and wants to set him over the kingdom. At the very end of the chapter, in verse 28, it says this: "So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So in other words, his impact went even beyond the kingdom of Darius. It carried on. But once again, we see Daniel elevated. What is the story of Daniel chapter 6? It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. These are the bookends. This is the front and the back of that story. So I sat down and I took the text and I broke it down and I created a chiasm. You've been hearing about chiasms. Here's a chiasm. This is what it looks like. So the story of Daniel in the lion's den starts with Daniel being elevated. Then, because of some nasty people who are trying to set him up, they pass a law that says only the king can be worshipped. No one else can. That leads to death, because if you worship an earthly king, that leads to death. And also there was a threat that it might lead to Daniel's death. Then Daniel's condemned because, of course, the law had been written, and Daniel was now guilty of the charge. Because what happened? Daniel did not follow the culture of the day. He did not just join in with the masses. No, he went home and continued to pray to his living God, even though he was invited not to. He was asked not to, and his life would be at risk if he decided to continue. So then the king, of course, is hoping, because he loves Daniel, hoping for delivery. He's uncertain if there's going to be delivery. He cannot in the end help it, but he has to, in fact, condemn Daniel to the lion's den. Daniel is placed inside the lion's den. There's a stone that's rolled in front of the opening, and it's sealed with the seal of the king. The story continues. The king is hoping for delivery. The very first day, or the very first moment in the morning, at the crack of dawn, he runs over to this lion's den. He rolls back the stone and discovers that Daniel's still alive. Thank God Daniel's still alive. He's pleased beyond measure. Then the accusers are condemned. It turns out that the lions were hungry after all, and so the people that accused Daniel get thrown into the lion's den, and that was the end of that. And then there's a law that's passed that leads to life, which is essentially to invite people to worship the living God. The story ends with Daniel elevated. A chiasm of chapter 6. When you're reading, my friends, there's opportunity. In this case, you're watching, you're seeing a pattern. Tells you that in Middle Eastern culture, stories are told in a cycle, in a secular way. And this is where it is. What's the center? The center is Daniel is placed into a confinement behind a stone that rolled in front of. That's a clear line towards Jesus. I love this. I love this about the Old Testament text, that there's all these references to this. So in this case, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. One, God is at work. Jesus is at work. He wants to intersect with your life and mine. He almost paid for it with his life.
I'm going to call Pastor Bob up here, and I have one question for him this morning, and this is what it says.
All right.
It says, "Thanks, Pastor Bob, for your words this morning. The church in North America is more divided than ever. What might be the writing on the wall for the church today?"
Oh, that's a dangerous question, Brian.
Yes, sure it is.
I will share with you my personal convictions about this. I think it comes down to, I think the future of the church in North America, perhaps in the Western world, comes down to one thing. And I think that it is time for us, as individuals, each of us, to decide that we're serious about our relationship with Jesus, and that we will be about it, and that we will commit ourselves to that. And I think as a result of that, we're going to begin to care a lot about people around us, whether they're coworkers or friends or family or neighbors, whoever they may be, to help them to understand what it is to follow Jesus and to become bold in sharing that story. I think it comes down to that. And there's something about us being able to come together on a Sunday like this and to just experience this time in the presence of God together, and then go from here and know that because he's written something on our hearts, that we can bring something to the world, a message of hope and a message of reconciliation. And I think that's the call where we will find our common ground in who Jesus is, because I think he has to be at the very center.
All right. I'm actually going to throw one more your way,
Okay.
because it actually has to do with Jesus, whom you spoke of. And it says this, might you have taken this too far? It says, what was written on the wall on the day the king was murdered is hard to reconcile with what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, it's just a response to that.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yes, I've invited you into the journey of Bible study where I am looking for, I'm making the connection between God, who, when he appears visibly, does that through the person of Jesus and makes that connection then to how that also occurs in the New Testament. In this instance, I think it's a curiosity about what Jesus wrote in that moment. We do think that Jesus, we often think of him as a person who just expressed love and compassion, and that he didn't have harsh words. If you look through the New Testament in particular, he sometimes had very hard things to say to the leaders of the day. You see, because in their understanding of applying the letter of the law, they often miss the spirit of the law, which was the intention to begin with. And so Jesus finds himself in tension with those leaders. And so that's captured in this moment, certainly. I don't know what he wrote, but whatever he wrote, it made them become silent and want to disappear and no longer remain in this. And they certainly lost all the wind in their sails to be accusative or any of those kinds of things. And so that's why I think there may be a possibility that might those have been the words. I want to be honest with you. In my study of Daniel 5 and 6, I'm not yet satisfied. There's a very curious reference at the end of chapter 5 where, as far as I can tell, in the entire book of Daniel, there's only one birth or age given to one of the individuals. And at the end of chapter 5, it says, King Darius was 62 years old when he took the reign, following Belshazzar. And here's what I'm going to be looking into. I'm curious because it makes me wonder, why? And I want to encourage you with two things. One, that there's always more things to explore in any Bible passage, so that's one thing I'm going to be doing. But the other thing I want to say to you is most of you will have received an email inviting you to have access to a resource called Right Now Media. Well, I invite you to go to Right Now Media, go find the TMP channel, and then go look for, it's been posted, there's a whole series of videos that Nasser, our teaching team coach, has prepared, specifically on Daniel chapter 5. If you want to know more about the writings on the wall and some of the meaning of that, you can go and explore more, things that I did not share with you this morning because it would have taken up the entire morning. But go and take a look at that. But here's the thing I'm going to look at with the 62-year-old King Darius. It just makes me wonder. Because by the time Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he's an old man. It makes you wonder, is it possible that Daniel had been in captivity for 62 years in Babylon when Darius became the throne, the king of the throne? So that's what I'm going to be exploring, because there's always more curiosity when these things come up. So I wish you a curiosity about the discovery of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And if you've not made that decision because you're still curious about that, there's people here at the front of the stage who'd love to talk with you about that and also pray with you about things. Bless you as you recognize that this is Mother's Day and spend time with family, whatever your plans are. And for those of you that are grieving, know that we are grieving with you, that this is one of those days that has those dual experiences. Bless you, bless you, bless you, and we'll see you next Sunday as we continue our study of Daniel.